Today, the first thing we're going to be talking about is the role of a chair. Chairing fundamentally is about making decisions and how to follow through with it. There's no one-size-fits-all methodology on how you need to chair. The idea is to understand what the classroom needs, what the content requires, and how to make sure you can coordinate and facilitate that. Pre-discussions are the fundamental building blocks of every single PBL tutorial. It is exactly what will ultimately determine the focus of the post-discussion and what learning goals we address during your readings. So what does a good pre-discussion look like from a chair's perspective? Think back a little bit to the mentor session that you had where you were introduced to PBL. One of the first things that you might have noticed during the pre-discussion and the post-discussion is your mentor, and at that time your chair, asking a lot of questions. They're not necessarily supplying you with the information. They're not telling you this is the answer, but they're looking around. They're asking, what do you think about this? This author said X. Who agrees with that? Who disagrees with that? That is the core of chairing. It is trying to facilitate discussions amongst all of your peers. Now that you know what the role of a chair is, let's set up your pre-discussion. The first thing you're going to do in a pre-discussion is to allocate some time to read the text. Now, here's where your first big decision comes in. When do you read the text? More often than not, people will be reading the text immediately after the post-discussion and after the break during a tutorial group. This way, they're refreshed, they've taken a little bit of a break, and they're ready to dive in. However, sometimes you might have the scenario that the post-discussion might be a little bit too intense, or the pre-discussion assignment piece might be a bit too comprehensive. In these scenarios, it might be good during the previous tutorial to give your peers a bit of a heads up. Say, hey, I know that this tutorial might take a bit longer, so why don't we read the text at home and come to class so that we can dive straight in. So this might be simple, but how do you read an assignment text? A lot of issues that might pop up are sometimes students read the text, but they don't really understand it or they don't really engage with it in a deeper manner. The easiest way to fix this problem is to start writing, start underlining, start circling. So recommend to your peers that while you're reading the text, even if you're on your laptop, highlight, make some notes, highlight important words, concepts, and ideas. Things that might be interesting, things that might be confusing, things that you might not know anything about. Because that's the way you engage with the text on a deeper level. And more importantly, that's the way you have significantly more interesting pre-discussions. All right, the next step of PBL is brainstorming. Now, regardless of whether you guys manage to come to a problem statement or not, brainstorming is something that can help you understand the problem at a deeper level. The easiest way to come around something like brainstorming is to basically brain dump onto a board. So one of the easiest things to do is to go around the class, ask everyone to say one word, concept, or sentence that they found to be interesting or they think would pertain to the theme of the assignment that we're talking about. This is where we come back to when we told you underline, highlight, circle, all of those words can be part of the brainstorming. Sometimes you might also come under the situation of students might be a bit too shy, especially early on in the course when we still don't know each other. Students might not feel super confident sharing their ideas. That's perfectly fine. You can break these groups into significantly smaller groups of maybe 3 or 4 people. And in those scenarios, you can ask them to discuss within themselves. What did they find interesting? What did they not? And then you can tell for every group, have one person to sort of report back to the entire classroom. That way everyone gets a say, and that also makes your job so much easier because you get a lot of input and all you need to do is start juggling these ideas around and telling your note taker to sort of organize these ideas onto the big board or onto a digital board like Miro. All right, now that you're done with brainstorming, the first thing that we're supposed to look for is whether we've gotten any closer towards a problem statement again. PBL is modular, so if we haven't gotten through to any specific part, we can always come back to it. In case we have, let's talk about it. Let's discuss what our problem statement could be. In case we haven't, that's perfectly fine. It's time to now try to organize our brainstorms so that it can sort of guide us towards our learning goals. Because at the end of the day, our learning goals is what organizes and structures our readings during the self-study session. So, I did say earlier that let the note taker organize it, but this is a pretty tall task for one person to organize 14 people worth of thoughts and ideas and words. PBL is communal based learning. We work together, help each other to make sure that we can all learn together. So, for an example, we're finally using the board. We've got a problem statement, which is the ethical use of AI, because AI is all the rage right now. And we've got a handful of brainstorms around this. So, what could be some ways we can sort of categorize this? We have easy thematic categories that we can now figure out how to color code. So, for example, let's think about the ethics of AI or the regulations of AI. Amongst all of this, we can see stuff like the digital divide, thinking about the ethics, or algorithmic bias, or even the EU AI Act and regulation. What else do we have here? We have things like the profit motivation or the company's perspective when it comes to AI. So let's say the more economic considerations, right? The economic considerations could be tech companies, monopolies, profit, and even subscriptions, right? And finally, we might have something that's a little bit more close to home, something related to the user side of AI, how people, students like you, or teachers like me, use these tools, right? So let's look at the user side of AI. Here we have things like prompting, AI literacy, text generation, image generation, as well as AI models. So now you can see that we've sort of color-coded and organized these into different thematic groups. Obviously, this is not the only way we can sit and brainstorm, right? There are so many different ways. A super popular way is mind maps. You'll have another resource or another video in the module section on mind mapping. So let's see if we can work with these to figure out how to move towards the next step, which is learning goals. Once you've got your problem statement, you can jump straight into the learning goals. Here, you can ask your classmates to develop 1 to 2 or even 3 questions with each of the themes in mind. Sometimes students might struggle to come down to concise, specific questions. Don't worry. Tell them that it's not about getting to the question on the first shot, but iterating with the group. You can start with a broad question and we can all narrow it down together. That's not an issue whatsoever. However, even beyond that, there might be some issues in trying to get to specific, concise questions and getting everyone to contribute significantly. Here, you can go back to what you did during the brainstorming. Break the class into smaller groups, maybe 2 or 3, or especially the number of themes that you've already identified. Here, we have 3 themes. So maybe you can break your group into 3 smaller groups and tell them that they need to address each of these themes with 1 or 2 or 3 questions. So group A takes ethics, group B takes economic, and group C takes user base. So regardless of if you've managed to break your class up into groups or if everyone's just thrown a bunch of questions onto the board, more often than not, you're going to have way more than 6 or 7 questions. And that's perfectly fine. Honestly, that's better than having less questions. It's always better to have more questions because we can always narrow it down and make it much more targeted. So once you've got into 10 questions or so, make sure to go around the class and start asking people what could be redundant, what are we repeating ourselves, what could be combined. For example, if we had to think about regulation and the EU AI Act when it comes to AI, we could have a question about how to regulate AI, but we could also have a question about who to regulate when it comes to these tools. Those 2 questions are very, very similar and very closely related. So those can be combined into one. How to regulate and whom, or how to regulate OpenAI, or how to regulate another actor. So you can always figure out ways to combine and also create sub-questions so that in the end, we come down to somewhere between 4 to 8 learning goals. After you come down to these set number of learning goals, it's important to build a clear narrative. because sometimes students might have questions later on that are much more foundational to what we need to learn. So it's important to reflect even into the readings a little bit to make sure that the order of questions that you have is appropriate for what you're going to be studying. For example, again, if we talk about AI regulation and whether it's ethical to regulate AI at the expense of innovation, it might be odd to talk about something like the EU AI Act, a regulation that already exists, after whether this is ethical or not. So it might make more sense to talk about the EU AI Act first, talk about the regulations that already exist, and then broaden up the conversation about whether this should exist or not in the first place. So now, all of the tips and tricks that we've given you focuses on the fact on having a deep and engaging pre-discussion. However, this also means that this pre-discussion takes time, sometimes 30 or even 40 minutes. However, sometimes even post-discussions, especially good ones, take well over an hour. Now you can do the math. A 2-hour PBL session might not be enough for a deep post-discussion and an engaging pre-discussion. So it's important to recognize that your outcome or your output is focused on getting good, clear, and targeted learning goals. And everything else around it is modular. So everything else around it depends on your decisions. So make sure that you manage your time effectively, make sure that you engage with your peers well, and make sure that you maintain good time management to ensure that you have solid learning goals in the end. So if you manage to bear with me for the past 5.5 minutes, you'd be able to know what different tips and tricks you can use to effectively run a solid pre-discussion. Good job, congratulations, you've done it. You can find us in the next video when we talk about how to organize yourself for your study session.